So this is the Traxxas Rad 2, also known as the Radicator 2. I picked this up about a week or two ago, and I basically bought it because I was thinking about running a different car for the Classic class at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals. So for the past 2 times I went to Vonats, I ran my Tamiya Dirt Thrasher in the Classic class. I love that car, it's a great car, and maybe I'll run it again this year, we'll see. But both times, I won, I TQ'd and finished first in that class. So I figured, well, if I'm going to go back and run in that class again, maybe I might want to try something different. So I was thinking about trying a 2-wheel drive buggy, and the thing with that class is, in order to be able to run racing tires, as opposed to the old stock hard rubber tires, your car has to have a molded tub chassis, which is what this car has. So if you go back and look at cars from the late 80s and early 90s that were 2-wheel drive buggies that are sort of competitive or semi-competitive in terms of what features are on the car, and actually having a sort of a quasi-racing car, almost none of them have molded tub chassis. They all have, aluminum tub chassis like the old RC10, or graphite chassis like the Tamiya Astute or Super Astute or something like that. So I remembered from the very first issue of RC Car Action that I ever bought as a kid was the August 1994 issue, and it featured the Traxxas Rad 2 in a comparison test against a bunch of other cars. So I went ahead and I asked about whether this would be legal for Classic class, and sure enough it is. And so I'm quite pleased to learn that. So I'm just going to go over briefly what it has. The rear end of this car is really quite a lot like the TRX-3. The gearbox, I don't think it's exactly a TRX-3 gearbox, but it's quite a lot like it. It does have a little, it's a little dirty here, but there's a little screw hole in here that you can use to, in principle, adjust a ball differential if you had a ball diff in this kit. It comes standard with a planetary gear diff. What a planetary gear diff is, instead of like the bevel gear diffs that you would see in a TA02 chassis or a Manta Ray or a Tamiya Dirt Thrasher, planetary gear diffs are like what you would see in a Tamiya Avanti, where you have these teeny tiny little circular gears that run around a main center gear on the inside of the diff gear. It's just a different setup. So that's what this car comes with as standard. It's not sealed, so you cannot adjust it with diff oil. You just have to use grease. You can buy a ball diff for this, but they go for about $50 or $60, which is a bit steep in my view. So I'm not entirely sure yet if I want to use a ball diff. It does come with a slipper clutch. This uses the sort of older style Traxxas slipper clutches, where on the actual spur gear itself you have these little inserts where you put little, basically slipper clutch pads, and you can vary the amount of those pads that you use depending on the kind of traction of the surface you're running on, how tight or how loose you want to set that slipper. It's an interesting design, if not a little finicky, but that's what it comes with. Same, TRX-3 or Bandit style rear suspension arms, rear hub carriers, the rear suspension arm mounts. You can get different mounts for this. You can put wedges under the mounts, so you can adjust toe in and kick up if you want. It comes with plenty of roll center and a few camber gain adjustments for the rear bulkhead, and plenty of shock angle adjustments on the rear at the tower and the arm. For the front, again, 3 shock angle adjustments on the arm, 3 on the tower. The arms are not Bandit style or TRX-3 style arms. They're actually a little bit shorter. I don't know what Traxxas model had used those arms. I do know that the Nitro Street Hawk used those arms. So these might be Hawk arms, but they're not TRX-3 arms because the bulkhead is a bit wide. I think the TRX-3 bulkhead's a bit narrower to support having wider arms. But this is otherwise, a fair amount like the TRX-3 with, you can get different caster blocks here. The spindle carrier position, though, I don't think is adjustable. It's a fixed position. In the TRX3, you can move the spindle carrier up or down with spacers. Some roll center and camber gain adjustments on the front shock tower. One thing that's clearly very budget about this chassis, other than the molded chassis itself, is the steering assembly. This does not have a bell crank steering assembly. It's a direct steering assembly, which means that the servo horn coming off of the servo directly connects to the steering links. So you cannot adjust Ackerman in this kind of a setup, which kind of sucks, but this is, this car is meant for, or what I would use it for, is the classic class at Vonats. It's not meant for super competitive racing. This is going to have, a sport tune motor in it. I would think or hope that this kind of steering assembly is adequate, and the car is plenty adjustable, even outside of that, to be quite a lot of fun to use. So, I don't know. I think I'll probably, tear this down and replace all of the self-tapping screws with threaded screws, just to, save the plastics a bit. I have to rebuild the shocks, find better springs to use. These springs are maybe, especially in the rear, they're probably a bit soft. So I may have to get a few different spring rates. Put bearings in it. This car comes with bushings instead of bearings, so I think they're all 5x10 millimeter size, and so I just put those in the rear, in the gearbox and the rear hub carrier. And one thing you might have noticed is that this has team associated B5 or B6 wheels. I did this on purpose. So the car comes with different wheels. I do have the stock wheels for this car, but what I wanted to do is see if I could mount B5 wheels on this buggy, because I have plenty of B5 rims with tires that could be suitable for the Vonats track surface. So I might be able to save myself a bit of money by just using my pre-existing wheels and tires. For the front, you can mount hex wheels, like hex B5 wheels, for example, on this car. GPM makes a hex conversion piece for front wheel axles that use a 5mm wheel axle diameter. I may have talked about this in, I think in one of my Pro X or Pro XRT videos. So you can get that part, it mounts right on, and then in order to mount the B5 rims, either at the front or rear, you do have to ream the hole out a little bit on the wheel, because the holes, as it standard, is a bit smaller than the diameter of the wheel axles on the front or rear. So just ream that a little bit. This will slot right in. You can tighten the nut down. There's plenty of space here, as you can see, between the end of the lock nut and the threads on the wheel axle, so that should work just fine. So these are 2.2-inch rims with your standard tires. The stock wheels that came with this car were not 2.2-inch. I think they were 2.1 or 2.15. So in running a modern rim, actually, not only can you reuse rims from other cars, but you also get a different rollout, a different effective final drive ratio than you would with smaller wheels, which when you're running a silver can motor or a sport tune motor, it's going to help the car go a little bit faster. On the rear, there really isn't much you have to do, nothing special. All you really have to do is use the Traxxas wheel hexes. They do make a few different kinds. I don't have the exact model number offhand, but basically it's a wider wheel hex that's gray in color, and I think it's about 12 millimeters wide maybe. So you just use that on either of the wheel axles. You may have to use, I think I also used a washer between the drive pin and the outer bushing or bearing on the rear hub carrier, just to pick up any slack there. And then once you mount that, the B5 wheels fit fine. They just barely fit. As you can see, the threading here on the wheel axle actually doesn't quite make it out to the end of the lock nut. So I'm using just a bit of the nylon locking here on this lock nut. What I may instead use on the rear, instead of these lock nuts, are the serrated nuts that don't have any locking necessarily, but they just grab onto the wheel to lock it down. That should work fine. The inside of the wheel here just barely misses the rear hub carrier and outer camber link. And when I originally tried to mount these, I tried, using a more conventional or narrower wheel hex like this. It's maybe 5 or 6 millimeters wide. And when I did that, the wheel bound up against these two parts here. So really, you have to use an offset wheel hex. And the Traxxas, wheel axle diameters are a little bit weird for some reason. They don't, like if you try to use a Kyosho wheel hex or Tamiya wheel hex, they don't quite fit onto these wheel axles. So just get the Traxxas like wide gray hexes, and they fit just perfectly. And this will work just fine. Is there anything else to discuss? Not really, since I actually haven't really torn this car down. So I don't really plan to do much. Just bearings, replace the screws, maybe put better shocks on or rebuild these shocks, and that's about it. And hopefully I can get this done in time for Vonats this year. I don't know. I have a whole bunch of other projects that to work on. But at some point in the future, I do plan on running this in Classic class at Vonats. It should be a pretty cool car to run. So, yeah, that's it for now, and thanks for watching.